Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, young adult librarian extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from the children's room.
And we're here to continue our conversation about Greek mythology.
Yes.
I left it with a cliffhanger last time.
We did.
Yes. Cronus was defeated by Zeus. Now, when last episode aired, I had some questions from someone as to whether the weapon that was used to defeat Uranus was a sickle or a sigh. Now, from a symbolic standpoint, it doesn't really matter which one you use, because both of them are things that are used to harvest grain, and both of them can be deadly weapons. So they represent both death and life at the same time. But a sigh is most often associated, partly because it's easier to use as a deadly weapon, and partly because after Cronus was defeated, he sort of vanished from public memory, except that his name representing time is used in chronology and chronometer and things like that, chronicle. But he's also referred to as Old Father Time. If you've seen the cartoons of the old guy with the sigh and the baby for New Year's, that's what's left of Cronus in our modern time. That is Cronus, the old guy with the white beard and the sigh.
Okay.
That would later, by the Middle Ages, get transferred to an image of death. The sigh representing reaping of souls, the way you reap down grain and things like that.
Right.
So Cronus was defeated, but he couldn't be killed. There's a theory that none of the Titans could actually die. So he was locked away down in Tartarus, down in the pits of the earth. So what you had then was a lot of other Titans. There were 11 other Titans, and plus there was their offspring. They had had children and grandchildren by then, who are all pretty powerful in their own right. Every Titan was more powerful than the gods. In one version of the story, Zeus actually tries to use the sigh that Cronus used on Uranus. And although he's a god, it's so heavy he can't lift it. So the gods that we had at this point were Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, and Zeus. So they attacked the Titans. And this is a war that lasted 10 years. It was the first war in the universe, and it was pretty brutal. For one thing, the Titans represented forces of nature. And so the battles that took place involved volcanoes erupting and oceans being swept away and valleys being dug, and when they punched each other and when they threw somebody flying across the ground, they slammed into the earth and raised up a mountain with the impact and things like that. So they reshaped the earth with the force of their battle, and the Greeks could wander around and look at, point to, oh, that was raised up back when Zeus punched, such and such and so forth. So every aspect of the earth that we know of today was created during this huge titanomachy. And while this was going on, the Titans, as I said, represented forces of nature. To a very real extent, they had been in charge of nature. And for the first time, they had more important things to do. So without the Titans in charge, nature flourished. Animals and plants began spreading out, diversifying into new life forms, and occupying like every part of the earth pretty much, all of which out of control, more or less. So the battle went on a long time, and the gods were not doing that well. For one thing, if you think about them, Hestia, Demeter, and Hera are not known to be warriors. The god of war hadn't been born yet. Hades, Poseidon, and Zeus did the lion's share of the fighting. Hestia is famous for her compassion, Demeter for her generosity, and Hera for her cunning, which are all, good things to have in a war for the future of the universe, but not necessarily going to help you on the battlefield. Zeus knew he was in trouble. So he remembered some of Uranus's first children, the Cyclops and the Hecatombes, the 100-handed giants. Them, along with the Gigantes, the huge monsters that were created from the blood of Uranus after he was killed. So he went to Tartarus and he freed the Cyclops and the 100-handed ones, and offered them their freedom if they would assist him in defeating the Titans. And having been locked up in Tartarus for some time, they didn't have to ask twice.
I was going to say, remind me who enslaved them?
Uranus. He thought they were too ugly and disgusting and buried them deep in the earth.
That's right. Okay.
So he was dead now, but Cronus had defeated him, and they had no love for the Titans.
Yep.
So they easily joined the war. Now the Cyclops were extremely useful. The Cyclops, aside from being giants with one eye, were also really good craftsmen. They're surprisingly good at building things. And so the first thing they did was to pay Zeus back for his generosity by going down to their forge and hammering out a bunch of thunderbolts for them. Each of the Cyclopses has a name that refers to thunder in Greek. I forget what they are right now, but basically they represent lightning and thunder, the names of the different Cyclopses. So they create Zeus's thunderbolts. For the first time, Zeus has a weapon that can actually harm the Titans. And the thunderbolt, of course, will go on to become Zeus's signature weapon, the one that he's most famous for. So they attacked again. This time they did much better against the Titans. The Cyclopses attacked with weapons that they had forged themselves. The 100-handed ones didn't need weapons. They were living weapons. They were like living catapults that could hurl 100 stones at a time.
Right.
Yeah. So the battle was brutal, and it continued on, and this time the gods had the upper hand for the first time. The Titans finally surrendered. Some of them put up quite a fight. Typhon was the most dangerous. He represented storms. Our word typhoon comes from him. He was never fully defeated, but he was sealed inside a mountain, which he immediately caused to erupt into a volcano. And that was the Greeks' excuse of why volcanoes keep erupting again and again, is Typhon trying to escape. He would actually come back and be a recurring villain in Greek mythology. The toughest of the Titans, though, now that Cronus was dead, was Atlas. Atlas would have taken over the Titans if Zeus hadn't, stepped in and started the war. Atlas was by far the strongest. And Zeus set aside a special punishment for him. Now, previously, the previous sky gods, Uranus and Cronus, had to use part of their power to keep the sky and the earth separate so the earth wouldn't be crushed. And that has sucked up a lot of their godly power. And Zeus didn't want to waste any energy on that. So he forced Atlas to hold the sky in place so the earth wouldn't be crushed. He was staying in a good spot to lift up the sky in North Africa. So that would keep the earth from being destroyed by the weight of the sky. And he was forced to stand there forever. He stood there so long that he turned into a mountain. And today they referred to as Mount Atlas.
Oh.
And the oceans that washed around his legs were named after him too. That's the Atlantic. Now, when you drew a map, you always put a picture of Atlas on it in the old days, because he basically stood at the top of the earth holding up the sky. So you put a drawing of Atlas on it. And after a while, they just used shorthand and referred to every map of the world as an atlas. And today, they still print mini atlases today. So there you go.
Wow.
Yeah.
So before you go on,
Yeah.
I was thinking that we were referring to the statue who he's got the world, the globe.
That is him. However, the myth shifted over time, and it became holding up the earth
As opposed
to the sky. The
Right.
original one, it was the sky, which makes more logical sense, but that's hard to depict artistically, so it was drawn as the earth.
Ah, okay.
But that is Atlas in that depiction. So the Titans, because they couldn't get killed, are all chucked into Tartarus, with a few exceptions. The children and grandchildren mostly made it out all right, except for the ones that actively opposed Zeus. Now, the Titans were incredibly powerful, and they're also physically beautiful, because almost everybody was in these days. And Zeus had always had an eye for the ladies, so several of the female Titans got cushy deals from Zeus. Exactly how many of them kissed up to Zeus to get clemency, we don't know. But Metis was a female Titan who had been one of Zeus's tutors. He was being raised in the cave. He had always made it clear he was hot for teacher, and she had kept him at arm's length, but now she decided it was the time to step up, and she became Zeus's consort and first wife.
How is it determined that Zeus was top dog?
He was the strongest one there, plus he had the thunderbolts now. He was also their natural leader, being the one that killed Cronus. Theoretically, he inherited the throne by killing the previous king.
Okay.
So he married Metis. Unfortunately, there was a prophecy that if Metis gave birth to a son, he would overthrow Zeus the exact same way Zeus had overthrown his father and Cronus had overthrown his father. And so Zeus was very upset about that. So he wound up actually When Metis got pregnant, he wound up cannibalizing her and eating her. This is a really horrible, horrible thing, as I can tell by the expression on your face. It's the worst thing Zeus ever did.
I would hope so.
Yeah, he was young, he was inexperienced, he was trying to rule the universe. He had a lot on his mind, a lot of pressure. It's uncharacteristically cruel of him. It really is. He did a lot of awful things in his life, mind you. But yeah, Metis, whom he seemed to genuinely care about, he nevertheless consumed. This would work out in the long run for him anyway, not for poor Metis.
Well, I suppose at least she'd always be with him.
Exactly. Well, her name in Greek means wise counsel, which is why she was his tutor when he was growing up. And some mythologers say that Zeus's intelligence actually increased having devoured Metis. He had literally internalized her wise advice, and it made him wise enough to rule. Other female titans got slightly better deals.
Slightly?
Yeah. Nemensid, whom I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, Mnemosyn. She was the titaness of memory. She would become Zeus's consort and work with him, and she was always good for keeping track of things because she is literally the goddess of memory, or titaness of memory. She would give she would give birth to the phrase mnemonic. Are you familiar with mnemonics? Yes. So any phrase you have that helps you memorize something comes from her. The other titaness who got a cushy deal was Themis. Themis was the titaness of justice. And she would be by Zeus's throne and help him rule wisely. Now you know Themis, even though you don't know her by name. You know that statue outside of virtually every courthouse of the lady in the robe holding up a scale?
Okay, yeah.
That's Themis. She represented justice, and she would weigh out people who came before Zeus's throne.
How funny is that?
Yeah, so he had memory and justice as his consorts to help him going into ruling.
Just that these elements are so distinct in our society.
As I said in last week, the Greek culture has become a part of our society in ways that most people aren't even faintly aware of.
Right. Which lends more of some sort of credibility of some sort. To what end, I'm not sure, but...
Yeah, it's really hysterical because many years ago there was someone who was making a statement at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., and he was posing in front of reporters in front of a statue of Themis, who in this particular version had her outfit draped down so that one breast was bare. And he insisted on draping something over her so he wouldn't get the bare breast in the photo op he was setting up. So yeah, she was okay dressed like that for a few thousand years, but, you know. So the other titans who made out really well were guys, Prometheus and Ephtheus. They're two powerful titans who joined Zeus. Prometheus' name means aforethought. So Prometheus was very good at thinking ahead. It is quite likely that he could foresee that Zeus was going to win and convince his brother to turn on the other titans and join forces with Zeus. He would become Zeus's best pal for a long time, but eventually they would have a falling out. But the rest of the titans were tossed into Tartarus, where for the most part we don't hear from them ever again. Kronos goes on to be a recurring villain in the Percy Jackson series. I brought out the illustrated edition of the first Percy Jackson book. And he's a frequent villain in stuff that has Greek mythology theme to it.
Right.
He's the angry, bitter ex-king who'll do anything to get power again. So these 6 gods ruled the earth, 3 males and 3 females. So Zeus and his brothers decided to divide up the world, essentially. Now Zeus already had the sky. He was a sky god because he controlled the lightning bolts. And his signature, his totem animal became the eagle. Because the eagle, the Greeks considered to be the king of the skies, just like Zeus was the king of the gods. Yeah, makes sense. Zeus's Roman name was Jove or Jupiter. He had a planet named after him, the largest planet in the solar system because he was settled for nothing less, I'm certain. And then when it came time to divide up the rest of the earth, he hid stones in his hands. He put them behind his back and juggled the stones around. And there was one stone that was a blue gemstone, and one that was jet black. And he held the stones out and had his brothers Poseidon and Hades choose. And wouldn't you know it, Poseidon chose the blue gem and was given control over all the oceans. Hades chose the black piece of jet and wanted control over the underworld. It was a completely fair divide so far as anyone knows, but Hades was still not happy. We'll get to Hades in a second. First, we'll discuss Poseidon. Now, Poseidon became god of the sea. In honor of that, the Cyclops went back to the forge and they hammered out his signature weapon, which was the trident. And the trident gave him control over the ocean and all the waves. We know that earthquakes cause tidal waves. So Poseidon also became the god of earthquakes. And he's also the god of horses, which bothered me as a kid because horses don't seem to fit into his portfolio very well. But the way it works is he had fallen for Demeter and wanted to impress her, as guys do. So he created horses. He figures that Demeter spends all her life wandering through the fields, so she'll love an animal that does, the same thing, basically. So he brought horses to life. And while she liked horses, she wouldn't go out with him. So to this day, though, he's still the god of horses. Poseidon's Roman name was Neptune. He too has a planet named after him. Now, he was not as profligate as Zeus. Zeus just could not keep it under control. At this point in the world history, Zeus had already had at least 100 children. There's a Wikipedia page trying to list Zeus's lovers, and it goes on and on. I'm not even going to try to list them here. But Poseidon basically, settled down. He did have his loves. He doesn't appear in a lot of myths. When he does, it's usually he's angry because you've offended him in some way, so he does something terrible, like poor Odysseus, who got in Poseidon's bad side. Basically because the Greeks were mariners. They were a trading people and a fishing people, and mariners always fear the storms at sea. Mm-hmm. So Poseidon, to a certain extent, they were always afraid of. So the angry side of him comes across in the few myths in which he actually pops up and says or does anything. He married Amphitrite. It might have an extra syllable in there. Amphitrite. She is a Titaness who was a Nereid. So she's like the grandchild of the Titans of the sea. And she was a sea goddess in her own right. Very beautiful. She was also part human and part fish. Their child was Triton, who was like a merman, basically. Human above the waist, but a fish down below the waist. Triton, of course, famously would go on to father a whole colony of mer people who lived at the bottom of the sea in a city they called Atlantis. And Triton is famous because he had many daughters, the youngest whom was Ariel, who went on to become the Little Mermaid. And Poseidon also had his dalliances with mortals. Mm-hmm. And one of his children was Percy Jackson, right, who appears in the whole series of books by Rick Riordan. So Percy Jackson and Ariel, the Little Mermaid, are related. Percy is actually her uncle. I'm not saying there's going to be a crossover, but there is a new Percy Jackson television series coming on from Disney Plus. And if you write your letters right now, we can get a crossover. It totally works. And Hercules is Ariel's cousin, so,
Very cool.
Yeah. So that was Poseidon. And again, he doesn't appear in that many myths. And then there's Hades. Now, Hades...
so he felt like he had got a raw deal? Hades
felt like he got a raw deal. He was bitter. He was sullen. It was theoretically a fair divide. He's given control over the underworld. And at this point, because everything was immortal, no one had died. So there were no souls in the underworld.
Oh.
So it was a big, empty cave with nothing but, captured titans in it. The Cyclopses tried to make him feel better, so they hammered out a signature device for him too. And instead of a weapon, it wound up being a helmet of invisibility, which was cool, being invisible, but it's not a thunderbolt that kills gods or a trident that gives you control over the seas.
Well, you just described an empty space. Who does he need to be invisible from?
Yeah. It's not a bad gift. I'm sure he's very polite when he accepted it. And because you took riches from the earth, gold and gems and things like that, as the lord of the underworld, he was also responsible for wealth. His Roman name was Pluto, and so words like plutonic or plutocracy, referring to rule by the rich, both come from him.
All right.
In one of the Percy Jackson spin-off books, one of his offspring has the power to locate anything that's buried underground because he's kind of one with the earth. The planet Pluto is named after him, the coldest, darkest planet. And then, just to add insult to injury, it was demoted from being a planet to a planetoid. Like, being Lord of the Underworld wasn't insulting enough. And then it gets worse, because modern interpretations, now to the Greeks, Hades was not a nice guy. He was implacable and ruthless. But at the same time, death was a natural part of life. And in those days, no one had invented the concept of hell.
I have to press pause. Was he, prior to being designated to this space, was he that way prior to?
I don't know. Maybe he was always dark and broody. There's a theory that like Zeus deliberately gave it to him because he thought it would fit his personality. I don't know. It's hard to say.
I would beg to argue that his reaction indicates otherwise.
Yeah, he was always bitter about the whole thing. He was never satisfied. But he was not seen as evil. He was not a villain.
Right.
But in the time since the Greek myths were written down, we've gotten into the idea that the underworld is a place of eternal punishment ruled over by the devil.
Right.
Hades' name went on to become the name of the place that he ruled in Christian mythology. Hades and hell are synonymous, even though the Greeks had never heard of the concept of hell. Most people in the underworld in Greek times were not punished. The underworld was just a dull place where you stood around and did nothing most of the time.
And how did one come to be there?
After you died, you went to the underworld. There were people who were so nasty, who did really horrible things or offended Zeus or the other gods, that they got special punishments. But for the most part, you were just hanging out down there. There's something called the Elysian Fields. That was like a paradisical place. But at the same time, it was also a place where nothing happened.
So was Hades a last stop, or?
Hades was the last stop. He was also known as the judge of the dead.
I'm sorry, the
Hades,
land
yes.
itself.
Yes, Hades encompassed all of that.
So when people died and ended up there, it wasn't like a purgatory kind of space.
No, it wasn't. That was it. That was where your souls went. One of my favorite scenes in the Odyssey is where Odysseus has to go to the underworld to get information from someone who's passed on. Mm-hmm. And he makes this animal sacrifice, and the fresh blood attracts the ghosts, the spirits from Hades. He goes down to the mouth of Hades to do this, to attract them.
Okay.
Because even in those days, they knew that the dead craved blood. And when he's down there, he sees a bunch of his old comrades that he fought alongside during the Trojan War, and they're really upset. And they say, Odysseus, in the underworld, great heroes are treated like everybody else. And he's like, I can't help you. There's nothing I can do for you. So that was Hades to the Greeks. But in modern interpretations, people just can't accept that. The underworld has to be a horrible place, and they have to make him into a villain. He's basically Satan in the Disney Hercules cartoon. He has flaming hair. He wasn't associated with flames in Greece. He gets people to sign contracts to steal their souls.
Yep.
He does all the things we associate with Satan.
Okay.
He never rebelled against Zeus in any of the myths.
Okay.
He plays very little role in most myths because he doesn't have a throne in Olympus, because the underworld is his home. Therefore, that's where his throne is, in the land of the dead. So he's the only one who doesn't have a big glossy throne in Olympus.
Wait, so why would Poseidon, if Poseidon lives in the ocean?
For whatever reason, Poseidon had a throne.
Well, that doesn't seem fair.
It is not fair at all. It was totally, and he should have protested. He should have filed a firm protest.
HR.
I know. What do you do when Zeus treats you badly? And he's the ruler of the universe. He always got the short end of the stick. In the first Percy Jackson movie, The Lightning Thief, in the book, Kronos is the major bad guy. It's Kronos who's really behind it all. And, Hades appears, but just as one of those obstacles Percy has to overcome.
Right.
So in the movie, they shifted things around, so Hades is essentially the big bad.
Yep.
Who does everything. And, that would have really annoyed not only Hades, but the Greek gods, the Greeks themselves. Because that wasn't how they saw Hades at all.
Okay.
The one myth that Hades plays an important role in, he does come across really badly. Wanting companionship because he's very lonely down there. Well, eventually humanity was invented, and human souls did start to go there. So he had things to do. He could judge the dead now, but he was still all alone. Everybody else had a wife or two. So he saw the really beautiful Persephone wandering through a field and kidnapped her with his chariot and took her down to the underworld to sweep her off her feet, the way guys were expected to do in those days. She did not take it very well, apparently. And her mother, who was Demeter, took it even worse.
You mean she didn't like being kidnapped?
For some reason, being kidnapped and assaulted, Zeus assured him it would be fine. Chicks love that. But apparently, Zeus was completely wrong about what women want. And so Demeter, in a whole cycle of stories, wanders the earth trying to recover her lost daughter. And eventually discovers that she's in the underworld with Hades. So she goes down there, tries to negotiate with Hades, and while this tricky business is going on, Persephone winds up eating 6 pomegranate seeds. Because she's eaten the food of the underworld, a part of her has to stay there. And so Demeter insists and tries to get Zeus to come in and judge all this, and he's like, well, Hades does have a point. So ultimately, the deal they finally reach is that she'll spend 6 months in the underworld and 6 months on the surface, which is why we only have things that grow and are fertile for 6 months out of the year, and the rest of the month we have crappy, miserable weather where nothing can grow. It all makes sense. Many versions of the story, Persephone wound up being okay with the deal in the long run, because it's so harsh having him do that.
I believe there's a medical term for that.
Yeah, it's probably Stockholm Syndrome. So those what happened to the gods. That's how they divided up the world. But you had 3 goddesses, too, who were all very powerful in their own right, without being warriors. But now that the war was over, they could come into their own. There was Hestia. Hestia was the goddess of home and hearth, which does not sound very impressive to us. But she was in charge of the home fires that you cooked over, the fires that kept you warm during the winter. She may have been the most worshipped goddess because almost every home in ancient Greece, we believe, had a little altar to Hestia in it. The Romans adopted her and changed her into Vesta, and she was in charge of the Vestal virgins back in ancient Rome. And the sanctity of all of Rome depended on keeping their bodies unsullied. How the Romans thought that would work, I don't know. It's interesting because the Greek word for hearth is cardia. And that's where we get cardiology from, the study of the heart. Because the hearth is literally where the heart is.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So in some ways, she's the least interesting of the goddesses. One that appears the least in myths. She just fades into the background. Rick Riordan actually gave her a plum role in the first cycle of Percy Jackson books. She actually plays a major role when all the rest of the Greek gods have fallen, which I thought was really nice of him. I guess Rick Riordan appreciated the fact that Hestia is always there, rooting for the home team, even though she never really plays that big a role. And she was followed up by Demeter, the goddess of growing things. Her hair was the color of ripe wheat. I mean, she was a blonde. And she was the goddess of harvest, so obviously she was really super important to farmers, which most people were in those days. Or you raised grapes to make wine and things like that. She was still worshipped a millennia after the rest of the Greek gods were not, because rituals to Demeter remained a part of European folklore well into, historical times. Little fertility things that you did were still being practiced all across Europe. It would not shock me if to this day they're still being practiced by farmers, out somewhere.
Wow.
Now, the Roman name for Demeter was Ceres, Ceres. And that gives us our word cereal.
Ah,
Because all the early like breakfast foods and things are all made from grain.
gotcha.
So cereal comes from Ceres. But neither of those two play a major role in Greek mythology. The big goddess on the block was Hera. Hera was quite a character. She gets a bad rap from a lot of people, and it's understandable why. But if you look at where she comes from, Hera's personality traits were she was imperious, proud, and ambitious. She wanted to get ahead in life. I mean, who could blame her? She was beautiful. She was immensely powerful in her own right. She was cunning. Some mythographer referred to her as like that head cheerleader who just has to score with the captain of the football team, you know? Yeah, that's Hera. And in a way, who could blame her? Zeus was young, he was handsome, he ruled the universe. You know, what's not to like? Well, the obvious answer is that Zeus, has no control over his zipper. So when you think of Hera, for the most part, almost all of the myths that she appears in, she's wreaking jealous vengeance on some woman that Zeus is sleeping with. Either immortals or mortals. Either way, Hera doesn't like it. Instead of hammering out their differences and working on a poly relationship, or just accepting the fact that Zeus will never respect her the way she deserves, she insists on getting jealous every time Zeus steps out on her, and he did it all the time. So Hera pops up mostly cursing people and hurling monsters at them to kill them. She made Hercules' life a living hell. She's remembered for being jealous and vengeful, which were not her best qualities. Her totem animal was the peacock. That's how beautiful she was. In a lot of depictions, she has peacock feathers in her hair, that kind of thing. She was also very interested in building a civil society. She wanted to be a wife and mother. She had that perfect, house in the suburbs in her mind. And she helped build Olympus, the city they built for themselves, into a place where people could actually live. And that became the model for cities all across ancient Greece. She wasn't the goddess of home and hearth, but she was the goddess of an orderly civil society, which is what she liked. Hera has no planet named after her. Yeah, she did not get a planet.
Okay.
Yeah, misogyny in action, yeah. And unfortunately, there is another equally unfortunate thing associated with her. Her Roman name is Juno. And if you've heard the word Juno-esque, that refers to a woman who's maybe a little on the heavy side.
Oh.
Yeah. A Juno-esque woman is one who is very curvy.
That's actually a new term for me.
Yes, it's. Our society is so obsessed with thinness. There are very few words to describe someone who's a little heavy that don't sound horribly insulting. A Juno-esque is a way of describing a full-figured woman who is still extremely attractive, because Hera definitely was, without being insulting. But however, having shapely hips was not what Hera wanted to be remembered for. I don't think that was her strong point. Plus, if you look at the depictions of her and all the other goddesses, by our modern supermodel standards, they all had some weight on them.
Right.
Because that was considered to be healthy in those days.
Yeah.
And those days, if a full-figured woman was considered healthy and well-fed and strong. So that was not an insult. If you went back in time and told, Aphrodite or Athena or Hera that, their BMI was terrible, you'd get hit with a thunderbolt really darn fast.
Well, not just not an insult, but preferable, right?
It was preferable by far.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was true for a long time until our modern world, when somehow thinness became the obsession with our modern society. So those were the big six of the Greek gods. You may have heard that there were 12 Greek gods, because the rest of them are still to come.
Okay.
Because 6 is a good number, a powerful number, but 12 is a much more powerful number. There were 12 Titans, after all, as Zeus wanted to equal the power of the Titans in their day, which meant they had to acquire 6 more gods, which meant the male and the female gods had to get busy.
Is there any correlation to the fact that we have 12 months?
Yes, there is actually. 12 is a magic number, not just in Western civilization, but all over the world. There's a cycle of 12 animals in the Chinese zodiac, for instance, and they weren't influenced by Greek mythology.
Right.
12 is a powerful number magically and mathematically because it can be divided up so many different ways by so many different numbers. There's a form of divination that involves numbers, and 12 is always very powerful and very useful in a divination because of that. Divided up by 2, by 6, 3 and 4, yeah. So that way 12 is a powerful number and a stable number. That's why we have 12 months in the year, 12 signs of the zodiac. All those things come from that. So these 6 gods would eventually fill out the rest of the empty halls of Olympus with more gods. And that's what we'll get to next time, is the rest of the Greek pantheon.
Sounds good.
You happy with it so far?
So far.
So far, the gods have been less violent and horrific than the Titans were. But they still haven't had a chance to really flex their muscles yet.
All right. Well, I will look forward to what they might do.
All right. So until next time, I have been Ed.
Solitaire.
We'll see you then, and be safe.